Welcome, Brennan, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm delighted to have you as my guest today. We connected originally a couple of years ago, and I know we had a wonderful conversation, and it's really great to reignite that conversation again today. Do you want to give a little intro about yourself and how you got into doing what you're doing for the benefit of listeners?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aoife. It is an absolute pleasure to join you. I love what you're doing with the podcast, and all of your research is so insightful. So it's a real pleasure,
Thank you.
and I feel honored to get to be a part of what you're doing. So yeah, my name is Brennan Jacoby. I'm a philosopher by training, and I'm the founder of Philosophy at Work, which is a collective of philosophers and business psychologists that work with corporates on how they think. So we teach 9 thinking skills that connect up with the kind of life cycle of a team, of a business. We look at the specific skills that teams and individuals need to be able to really do their best in the way that work is now. So things like critical thinking, strategic thinking, curiosity, decision making, some really practical stuff, but also things that sort of create the right environment for thinking. So, I did my PhD on the topic of trust, and we work a lot with groups quite early on in the journey on things like trust and psychological safety, because we know that we don't think our best unless we feel safe. So, a lot of times we'll come in and work with the team. Maybe it's sort of their regular sort of together time or something like that, and we'll say, why don't we start with the space in which you're working, the way you're working, and then think about some of the way you collaborate, and then notice, okay, now what are some of the assumed ways of working? What are some of the beliefs that have been really running in the background of the work? And let's pick up some really helpful tools to sort of constructively together or by yourself process that and think through it, so that we can get off kind of the busyness and actually make time to first of all appreciate what's going on, but then also make better decisions and think through it more properly. So yeah, that's what we do, and it's a real, I don't know, I'll be honest, it's a real joy. I love doing it.
Yeah. Well, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Like having that kind of impact, I think, is really, really important. There's loads to kind of pick apart there. There's loads to dive into, but where I would like to start is the difference that you have noticed between pre-pandemic and, let's face it, we're still kind of in the pandemic. We're kind of going through that flux, that change. Coronavirus is still about. Um, what's the big difference that you've noticed between pre and, let's call it, during, for want of a better expression?
Yeah, definitely. So for this one, I probably need to dip into like philosophy 101.
Woohoo!
Yeah, so the thing that first really drew me to philosophy was Dr. Charles Campbell and Philosophy 101 when I was doing my undergrad degree over in Michigan. So I'm currently sat in the UK, but I'm originally from Michigan. And he told this story that was written by Plato back in ancient Greece, but really grabbed me. And I think the what happens in the story is, I think, something that's happened during the pandemic. And in a nutshell, it's the allegory of the cave. So maybe you've come across this before. The idea is you sort of imagine that there's this cave, and in the cave there's a wall that's sort of in the middle of the room, in the middle of the cave. It's about, it doesn't go all the way to the ceiling. It's, I don't know, maybe 6 foot tall or something like that. And there's people sat on the side of the wall where they're facing the back of the cave. It's a little bit complicated.
Okay.
They're chained up, so they're chained to the wall. It's a little bit dark, this story, but they're chained up. Their heads are chained, their arms are chained, everything's chained, so that all they can do is look at the wall. They can't really do anything else. So all the perception, all the sort of content they're getting in their lives is just whatever shows up on the wall.
Yeah.
And so there's light coming from behind the wall and casting shadows on that screen from. So it's almost like they're in an ancient theater, and they're just, watching what these shadows are on the wall. And Plato says these people think they're living real life, but actually all they're seeing is shadows of what's actually going on outside the cave in reality. And he tells the whole story because he's trying to make the point that philosophy, which, if you go back to the ancient Greece, just means the love of wisdom. Philo is love, Sophia is wisdom. Philosophy as a thing is like this person who goes into the cave and unlocks the people and says, hey, look, what you've been doing is sort of just the shadows. Get out and sort of feel, you know, the real stuff, right?
Yeah.
And this came to mind the other day because I think something that's been going on in I'll say the pandemic because that's the frame of the question. But I think it's not just about COVID. It's not just about I don't know, having to go into self-isolation or work from home or something like that. I think it's also some of the social changes and reawakenings of important things around values and ways of being together and what counts as right and wrong and biases and ways of working. And it's kind of like we used to get up in the morning, you know, for me, I'd get on the train, go to London, and I still loved what I did, but I think there was a lot of people that maybe really, really loved it, but we weren't very engaged with what was really going on, or it felt like we were.
Yeah.
But I think now there's this sort of awakening where we go, gosh, I'm really alive to it now, you know?
Yeah.
So I think we were, you know, stuff was okay before in some ways. But I think there's been this, it's, you know, there's been a lot of talk during the pandemic about everything being accelerated. That's kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's just right to say acceleration. It's this like enlivening of noticing and this of what's really going on. And this is why I think people are talking these days about, you know, not just the sort of great reshuffle, the great resignation, but the great like reassessment. I think that's, you know, in Plato's allegory, the people get unchained and actually at first they don't like it. They go like, this is, it's pretty uncomfortable to try to stand up and move because I've been chained forever. They don't like it and they kind of beat up the philosopher. But that aside, it's this reassessment of, okay, well, I thought that was real. What else is going on? So that's at a high level. I think what that looks like in practical terms is there's been a real recognition that, gosh, we were taking some stuff for granted. We were making some poorly thought through assumptions. The way that we think is really important. Our mindsets are really critical. And so, you know, stuff like curiosity and, you know, checking our thinking before might have felt like quite a soft skill, whereas now it's feeling quite business critical.
It's really interesting. We were saying that before we started recording that it's something I see a lot in the entrepreneurial world where you know, mindset. It's kind of make or break when you're in business. You really have to understand how you think, but it's not something I hear all that often in the corporate world. But it is something that I'm hearing more and more about. Do you want to explain for listeners, like what do you mean when you talk about mindset, and what are some of the mindsets that people might be stuck in, or what are some of the shifts that they could go through?
Yeah, definitely. So I think sometimes a lot of the work that comes to mind for me when I think about mindset is specifically growth mindset and the work of Carol Dweck, the professor of psychology over at Stanford University, in California. And a lot of times when we're working with groups on sort of how they navigate change and how they ask better questions in a meeting, let's say, for the purpose of the work and spotting the opportunities, spotting the threats. It goes back to, well, why are we not asking the questions? Sometimes it's because we're uncomfortable. You know, our mindset, which I would just say a mindset. So I've adopted Carol Dweck's sort of account of what a mindset in general is. And she says that a mindset is a set of beliefs. So you could say a mindset is a worldview, right? And it is just the things that you say are true about life. And sometimes the things that we say that are true about life stop us from saying what the good ideas we have, or asking the questions that really need to be asked, because maybe somewhere in the background is this premise, the belief that if I ask a question and people don't like love me for it, then it was bad, you know, or if I make a decision and the outcomes are not the ones that I wanted, it was bad. And that's not, you know, in the light of day, we sort of know that's not true. But in the moment, it sure is really easy to get into.
And when you're experiencing that firsthand, the result of, let's call a perceived poor decision when you made the best decision you could given the information that you had.
Yes, exactly. That makes me think of Annie Duke. I don't know if you've come across her work. She's a
No.
so she's a professional poker player,
Okay.
and she has but she also has a background in psychology, and she has this great book called Thinking in Bets that we use a lot in our workshop on decision making. Well, we use it at the start because she has this great point where she says, when you're making, when you're playing professional poker, you're making high stakes decisions, in succession.
Yeah.
And it's very tempting to get into what she calls resulting. Now, apparently that's a term in the poker world. I don't know. I'm not a big, but apparently this is a thing. And resulting is when you quantify the value of a decision. You say that a decision is good or bad based on the results that came after the decision. Yeah. So she says, say that you've got a hand and you play, I don't know, whatever a good hand is, this card and this card, right? And you win big. Then next time you've got those same cards, you might think, oh, that worked well for me last time. I'm gonna play those same cards, expecting to win big. Equally, if the results are bad, you think that's a bad strategy in the game. And she says, that doesn't really work in life, because life, just as poker, is not a closed system. So there's bluffing and there's chance and there's all sorts of things. And so what I think is a good example of the kind of stuff that we try to do with groups is to say, let's notice the assumptions that we bring to our work, whether it's management or collaboration or decision making, whatever it might be. And then let's sort of step back and check those assumptions. Is it right to think that the outcomes determine the goodness of a decision? And Annie Duke says, well, when you're playing poker, the best, a good decision is not one that makes you lots of money, as tempting as it would be to think that. A good decision is one that is based on a well-formed process. Okay. So you've done the sort of probability of what cards are going to be in other people's hands. You've done the hard yards of, doing the science of the job, basically. You've done your research. And based on everything you could possibly know as a human in an uncertain life, you made a decision. And, maybe you lost, maybe it didn't go well, but you can hold your head high because that was a good decision based on the structure of it.
The process that you followed. Yes.
Yeah, that's the only way to really learn to be making better decisions. Otherwise, you're just trying to court fate the whole time and hope they like you, So I guess to circle back to what we were saying, it's in the workplace, as in contrast to the entrepreneurial world that you highlighted. I think mindset a lot of times is how we frame. I'll say that, how we frame the work that we do in our minds, which informs how we talk to people, what decisions we make, what we do, and it's a collection of beliefs. And if we slow down enough, we can notice it, and we can get better at noticing it, even at pace. So that's what we try to help people do.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think that it's not talked about more, and I think for me, it's pretty fundamental to how you get stuff done. Especially in this day and age of burnout and people being, the perception I have is people are just super busy and they're doing a lot of stuff. And I'd love to come back to this concept of the growth mindset, because it's probably the one that is familiar to most people, the idea of a growth versus a fixed mindset. Right. And I have read the book and I loved the book, but something again that in becoming aware of a growth versus a fixed mindset, something I noticed about myself is that it's not just black and white. For me, it's I have a growth mindset in some areas and I have a fixed mindset in other areas. And I think that's something that she didn't completely address in that book, but it's something that I've noticed myself in thinking about, I know I can improve in that area. And then there's other areas where I'm like, I'll never be good at that. Those kind of beliefs that I have.
Yeah. That's a great point. I also have that critique of the work, and I think where I think maybe it's more helpful is also probably a lesson that I take from historical philosophy, and that is that it's we're trying to assess and pay attention to each sort of moment of thinking. Now, I mean, that sounds really overwhelming. I don't mean that we always have, like, we have to be conscious of
who's
everything.
thinking the thoughts and who is the
Right, right.
thinker, and
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, if we're sort of, I'm a fan of mindfulness, but if we're mindful all the time, it can be a bit scary maybe. But so I don't just mean like noticing everything all the time, but taking, a question or something that someone says in a meeting, looking at a value that a team has come up with, and recognizing it, putting it in the context of the bigger story. But part of what I hear you articulating is, well, either I've got a fixed mindset or I've got a growth mindset. And that is like, that's sort of, that conclusion is actually very contrary to the concept of growth mindset, right? It's sort of over identifying with.
Now we're getting very philosophical.
Yeah, and the when I started trying to do this kind of work, I was thinking like, philosophers have a big problem, because what I didn't want to do is put historical philosophers, historical characters that we file under philosophy. I didn't want to put them on a pedestal, because they're human and they've got caught up in some bad stuff throughout history. And I don't think it's something about philosophy, it's something about people, I suppose. But I've been really careful I don't really care that people leave the workshops we do and things being able to talk about philosophy or talk about philosophers. I want them to learn the approaches, the sort of nuts and bolts of thinking that those people are famous for, and try to do that. And I think this is related to what you're saying, because instead of being like, Socrates was this great person, and I'm gonna try to be just like Socrates. Well, that's kind of like going, you have to either have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset all the time. You've got to be like Socrates all the time. And that's just not possible. It's not accurate. But if we can go, well, what was he doing there? He was trying to pay attention to what people were saying. And he was really curious. He was asking questions to try to unpack like what was really going on about, I don't know, power or decisions that we're making. And if we can bring that in a case by case kind of way, then I think that's really positive. But I mean, if philosophy was only good because philosophers are good all the time, then it'd be a non-starter. So.
And the other thing that kind of coming up for me is this idea that, and maybe this is tied in with the idea of having a growth mindset, but is it a case of becoming aware of how you make decisions, of how you think, of how you, like really boiling it down to how you process information, let's say, how you actually think about things, and are you able to teach people how to notice when their thinking is maybe, and I suppose for me, it goes back to this idea of it's only, and I'm kind of reluctant to use the word bad, but it's only detrimental, let's say, if it's causing harm, or if it's causing us to not perform at our best because of how we're thinking. Have I articulated that in a kind of a roundabout way? But it's first of all isolating whether or not we can teach people. Is that through first of all becoming aware of how we think, and then noticing it and implementing changes based on what we notice about ourselves. So tying in with this idea of self-awareness.
Yeah, that is a brilliant question. I love that. I feel like that there's a few books in that.
Okay. There you go.
But I love it, because you're right. I guess if I'm hearing you right, question is, can we teach this stuff? And if so, what's the journey that you go on to sort of become better at thinking, right? And it reminds me of, I mean, I said it's not about quoting historical philosophers, but I've got to quote another one. There's a 20th century Irish philosopher, oh gosh, name's just gone away. Iris Murdoch, there we go. So a novelist, right? And she has this great quote where she's articulating what in her view philosophy is, and she says, I'm gonna paraphrase, but she says something to the effect that philosophy is an attempt to uncover the truth while at once trying to understand yourself. And so if, and that's because
A mystery
um,
wrapped in an enigma.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
but it's not just sort of um, big words and it's not just sort of something aspirational. I think what she's on about is that when we're if we're doing so, I think philosophy is not just this like thing in ivory towers where that we might associate with like thinking big thoughts, but I think it's this it's done. It's something that you do. I mean, I don't mean
Mm.
it's over. It's done.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
something that you do, and it's we're pursuing wisdom. We're trying to work out how should we live, and when Murdoch says that, I think what she's saying and why it matters to the kind of work that we're both concerned with in business is in work is she's saying you can't really work out like what is right and true, what counts as a good decision, or who you
Mm.
should hire, or like what's the right way to live, and what is good thinking, and have you arrived there. You can't really work out stuff about what's good without encountering yourself, because we all have subjectivity and we all
Yeah.
experience everything through our own lenses. So you're at once pursuing the truth and trying to work out yourself, and they kind of happen in tandem. And so
Yeah.
um so I think my sort of perspective is that, yeah, the way that we start going on the journey of like flexing our thinking muscles and toning them and trying to do good thinking is often by raising awareness about ourselves. And that can be the self as an individual, me, you, but it can also be raising awareness of ourselves as a team or ourselves as a business.
Mm.
And what I guess that looks like is, if it's us as an individual, then maybe it's going, how do I, how I'll just stick with decisions because it feels nice and practical, but how have I in the past, how have I made decisions? So one of the exercises we do in that workshop is we'll get people to map some of the biggest decisions they made in their life and track,
Wow.
okay, I chose this thing, but what was my process? Was I like, we talk about being an interviewer where we go and ask other people what they think we should do, or being a biologist where we get into the details, or an astronomer where we sort of zoom out and look at the big picture. What was your process? What did you decide? And in hindsight, would you say that was a good one or a bad one? And when people go through that exercise, there's oftentimes a bit of an aha moment to say, oh, wow, actually, there's a pattern here. I didn't realize that. And so a lot of times the moves that we make in our work that we're doing is to first say, let's recognize the pattern, and then step back and go, do you think that's a good pattern?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not like loaded. It's not I'm not assuming that it's a bad pattern. It might be a great one, but we're just going to keep doing it unless we at least, the first step to changing it, if we want to, is to notice it. And so, yes, a lot of times it is noticing what happens when we think, and we do that by getting curious, by picking up these sort of tried and tested ways of being good thinking partners, like Socratic dialogue and asking each other questions, and doing a lot of mind mapping and trying to say, okay, when I think of the word, so for example, I did a session this morning with a law firm where it was on curiosity, and I said to them, in English at least, curiosity is loaded. Like, we have this saying, curiosity killed the cat. And
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right.
It's
And
kind
so
of
it's
maybe associated with nosiness.
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or even like strangeness. You might say, oh, that's curious,
Yes.
meaning
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
bit odd or something. But at the same time, there's so many articles and things coming out saying, oh, curiosity is great.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly a proponent of curious inquiry and questions and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so to start, we said to them, why don't we take a moment and try to just map the connotations to around curiosity. And
Yeah.
so we got them to write the word curiosity in the middle of a page and circle it, and then go, now what comes to mind? And so for me, I'm from Detroit originally, and so when I wrote curiosity, one thing came to mind was wonder. And then when I thought of wonder, Stevie Wonder came to mind, and sort of music, and I thought, okay, that's an interesting like link in the neural map of my
Yeah.
brain, but that's not very helpful. So you go back up to it and go, well, what else comes to mind? Okay, curiosity makes me think of questions. When I think of questions, I think of challenge. When I think of challenge, I think of like conflict and stress. And I guess the reason I'm telling this story is there's a helpful, like teachable moment if we go, okay, I came along to this workshop or this topic of curiosity, let's say, and I'm here thinking, oh, this is great. We should all be more curious. But I've only got to go like 3 steps in my neural map to get to something like, stress and conflict, which is quite dark.
Yeah.
And so it's worth me knowing, if I'm going to try to cultivate my curiosity, that actually running in the background is some of these difficult concepts.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily, I'm not the expert to say like how you change some of that. I'm not the one to say like, let's do neuroplasticity and make it so that when you think of questions you don't think of challenge. I actually don't think that would be good. I actually think the awareness is the key point. So we go,
Yes,
okay,
yeah.
I have some connections between curiosity and stress. That's what it is. Maybe I can try to change those. Maybe I can't. But it's good to know, because I'm in a workshop right now about curiosity. And so if I'm feeling out of my comfort zone, maybe it's because of that thing. And when we name it, we can get better at sort of filing it, and filing it away sometimes, and go, okay, that's what it is. That's why I feel a bit uncomfortable. Maybe it's not the end of the world to be uncomfortable. I'll keep going. So I guess what I'm saying is, and that person is then thinking better. They're thinking better about curiosity. They've got a tool that they can use to think better about whatever the thing is they want to write in the center of that page. Maybe it's not curiosity, it's values or something else. And so it's awareness and it's techniques that help us notice and then choose, I suppose, how to respond.
Yeah. There's so much coming up for me in that. And if I kind of take a step back to this idea of patterns, first of all, you know, for me, it's when stuff keeps happening in your life and it's the same thing, and you kind of notice that it's the same things happening again and again in your life because it's not something that you've addressed. So the universe, or whoever you want to say, is, or your subconscious is bringing you into these situations so that you'll address something in yourself. So that's something that's kind of coming up for me when I hear about patterns and repeating patterns. And it's almost like a smack in the face. You're like, this happened to me the last time I tried to do X, Y, and Z. And it's because it's something that you haven't addressed.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have habits. And that's a good thing in some ways. Our brains fill in gaps and make assumptions, and we need that to survive. But it's not always helpful when we're hiring or making decisions or collaborating and things. And so I think noticing those patterns and then being able to choose. I mean, that's I don't think that all of philosophy is ancient philosophy, but there's a lot of great stuff going on now and ever since then. But another thing that some of the ancient Stoics would argue was that the whole like ball of wax when it comes to trying to live and live well was two things. The first thing they said was you gotta notice what's going on, like notice where you've pitched up. What is where are you now, right? What's the landscape? Okay, we're all trying to like navigate this new normal, whatever's going on. Where have you pitched up? And then secondly, what can you control or at least influence? And just like put your efforts there. And that goes back to the founder of Stoic philosophy being a merchant who was in a shipwreck and lost like everything at sea, washed up in Athens, was browsing a bookshop, apparently, or the equivalent, as you do when you're at a life transition, and found the writings of Plato and read about Socrates and was like, oh, this is something. And so, but you can see if that's their story, they're going, where have you washed up, and what can you do about it? And I guess the reason I say that is to your point about noticing the patterns. It's where have you washed up, or the patterns that are going on, and then what can you do about it? And don't waste your energy on the stuff that you can't control or that's just going to happen anyway.
Yeah. No, I like this. I'm a big believer in, and that, maybe that's part of this whole mindset thing as well, is knowing what you can control versus what you can't control, because I think a lot of people are stressed about things that are completely 100% out of their control. And it's bringing it back to thinking like, what is genuinely in my control, and exactly as you said, what's then within my sphere of influence as well as my sphere of control. But those things that are completely out of our control, how other people behave, what other people say, the global pandemic that was happening and kind of to a degree a little bit still is around us, that they're not things that we can control, but we can control how we react to those things, and kind of being aware of that, I think is really, really important.
And in there, I think that's a huge question. The one of what can I control and what I can't control. For the Stoics, their mindset, their worldview was one that was quite like interwoven with an ancient spirituality and religion that said that basically the only thing you can control is your mindset, and everything else is
Okay.
like up to the gods and stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty cut and dried. But I think in the world of work, there's a big question about, okay, so I've just listened to this conversation between Aoife and Brennan. Um, I'm now working on this project. The deadlines are blown out again. The suppliers, not playing ball. Budgets are problematic. So should I just go, well, I can't control that, because that sounds tempting, or and therefore not worry about it. But of course, we couldn't probably not worry about it. And so where should I agree with you that we can't control, I mean, you and me personally couldn't have controlled COVID coming into the world.
Yeah.
But there's a real blurriness about what's out of my control or not in the world of work. And that's why I think
Yeah, that's a good point.
it
Yeah.
pushes
Yeah.
me back to like the skills, and we get better at critical thinking and going, okay, well, and self-awareness. Oh, I feel
Yeah.
like I can't control that. But then if you've been working on self-awareness, you might go, no, you know what, I think that's me copping out. I can sort of feel that. Actually there's probably a bit of something here I can control. And you sort of might grasp your agency again and have a go. But also, all the other stuff, the trust and psychological safety, we need each other, because we need people that we feel safe enough to pull us up and go, do you know what, I think actually you could influence that, don't give up. And we need important feedback. And so yeah, I think it's the right premise, but there's a lot of work to be done there to go, what can you control?
Wow, it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, because you kind of see these, and I haven't seen it necessarily in the work context, but you see, the circle where it's like, what can I control? And, it's things like breathing, but then you say, but, if you hold your breath, you can't hold your breath forever. So can you really control your breath as well? So there's all these kind of funny things coming up. But interesting what you were saying about this idea of people's self-awareness, and is it a cop-out to say, actually, I can't control that, so I'm just going to wash my hands of it completely? And it's
Right.
maybe this sense of learned helplessness, which I know a lot of people might have as well, where you're so used to not doing something, or you're not taking responsibility for something, so you're like, oh well, that's theirs to deal with, or I'm not dealing with that. But there's probably two extremes. This is a whole other podcast episode probably, but there's two extremes where you're dipping in and you're trying to control everything that you can't control, and then there's the other extreme of completely, exactly as you're saying, like, it's a cop out, and I'm not touching that. And it's finding that balance, or that awareness, or are you really, if you're trying to control too much, maybe taking a step back and saying, I can't control everything that other people do. I can only control myself and my own behavior, versus understanding, am I just being really helpless now, and I can at least influence this project in some way?
Yes. Yeah, right. And I mean, there's so, you've just shown there's so much going on. There's so much
Yeah.
running in the background.
Yeah.
And when you layer onto that, like the power dynamics of the
Oh,
world of
yeah. Yeah.
work, where relationships,
Yeah.
as friendly as collegial relationships can be, there's a different, there's different dynamics, because it is employment, or it's
Yeah.
at least like gig working or something.
Yeah.
And there's money involved. And so it's like, there's all these things happening. And that's what really struck me, I suppose, when I started doing this kind of work, was, there was bubbling away people going, gosh, we need to, like, this is happening and we need to think carefully about this. And I'd be like, yeah, so what are you doing to help your people, like, think through stuff? And understandably, it was like, well, I don't know, because how do you do that? And so it's, I don't know. I think it would be unfair to say, silly leaders or something. It's hard to know where to start, because it is such
Yeah.
a woven web and stuff. But I think that, and we're not going to solve everything in one workshop or something. But I think planting some of those seeds around going,
Yeah.
well, let's notice what's running in the background, and let's notice what's going on inside ourselves.
Yeah.
The sort of psychological move, but then let's also do something that I think is distinctly philosophical as well, and say, let's understand what's happening outside ourselves.
Yeah.
And to the Iris Murdoch point, you can't really tease the two apart. It's interwoven.
Yeah.
But while I think there's a lot of emphasis on, say, behavioral economics, and going, well, let's look at how we can influence behavior change in organizations, there's not as much going on at the point of, well, what direction should we nudge behavior in? You know, what is good? And that's the remit of philosophy, and that's looking outside of people and critiquing morality and thinking about the landscape. And so that's why I guess I'm trying to encourage as many groups as possible to go, yes, you know, do the psychology pieces, which you know I know is your work, and I really appreciate everything you're doing around personal happiness and all the research that you've done. And I love to see that connected up with how does it impact how you think, or how does it intersect, I suppose I could say, with how you're thinking about the world that you're navigating as well.
Yeah, really interesting point. And you know, just to kind of, before we wrap things up, to come back to this idea of the power dynamics, like I mean, again, that's probably a whole other podcast episode, and I am really fascinated by this concept of power and how people get power. And there's if you have knowledge, then you have power. If you have unique skills, you have power. If you're given a label of a leader, then you have power. So there's all of these dynamics that are happening in the workplace. And you know, when it comes to dealing between people, when there is an imbalance of power between them, and as an individual dealing with someone who's a leader, for example, and you're being told to do something, but you blindly follow that and you don't question it whatsoever. But then it's having that self-awareness to A, question it and see if you can question it, or B, this is a leader who doesn't like to be questioned, or they don't like having their authority questioned, and therefore you just need to think about it, digest it, put it into your own way of thinking and approaching things, and get on with it and make sure it gets done. Any kind of thoughts on the whole power thing?
Yeah, I mean, I love that point. I think that's right on the money of, again, and actually it's kind of a nice analogy of the whole thing I think we've been discussing. There's the first move, which is like notice what's going on. Second move, like analyze, and where it's, you know, people and power involved. I think part of that is going, you know, I love how you put it, like, is this person safe? Like, should I challenge them, or is that just a really bad move? And again, there's a thought process there, and thinking through it. And then there's the choice of the sort of noticing, analyzing, action, and reflecting afterwards. You know, to be learning and moving forward. And I suppose the only other thing that comes to mind for me is there's been a lot done around like the philosophy of power, you know, and how we understand power dynamics. I guess, you know, there's a lot of interesting work at the moment in the professional space, trying to play some of this out, where we're going, what happens if we have like self-organizing teams? And if we, you know, because, you know, going back to your question before of what are some of the changes in the pandemic, and one of them certainly has been a lot of power has shifted from the traditional hierarchical model of a business to the people, you know, to the employees. And to some extent, it seems like that's there to stay. And now just kind of like historical times of transition, where there were new systems of government, and it's always been messy and working out like, well, okay, we think there's a lot of really good reasons to democratize the power within the business and within the organization, and ask people, what are your preferences? How can we empower you to work in ways that make you happy, that are good for you? But gosh, that's scary for people who have the power, maybe. I mean, it would seem, you know, I'm not one of those, but you know, I've heard there's so many stories and so many leaders that I am working with who, and they're not, you know, they're very, very far from being bad people. It's not like they're like, we've got to, you know,
it's not Dr. Evil you're talking about here.
No, it's not that. And again, I think that characterization that there's like good people and bad people, it's really messy. And
it depends on the context, I think, for some people. But probably for everyone, actually, should I say, it depends on the context, the environment that you find yourself in.
And I guess I'm kind of dancing around it, because I don't think there's one answer. I certainly don't have one answer for like how to deal with power in organizations. But I do think that what's really positive and constructive right now is the dance that's happening right at the moment. In a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, there is a give and take and conversations and a narrative going on,
Yeah.
and there's being things discussed around, well, how should we do this?
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of the businesses that I see out there are going, yeah, we're sitting with it. You know, I was speaking at an event last night, and someone made this great point. They said it's really tempting to want to have an answer right now for how we're going to be working in our team, but I think there's so much value if we can just like sit with the tension a bit longer,
Yeah.
because some things are going to get worked out, and that's really uncomfortable, or can be, but it's so fruitful. But it's, you know, you can't do that without, or you can do it without thinking well. But if you know how to process it, we're gonna, I think, get to a better conclusion. Because if we just go, right, I'm just gonna sit with the tension, but I don't know what to do with this. That's
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
going, I want to, you know, I want to write a book. I'm going to get a sharpened pencil and a nice coffee and just like do
And
it.
just
And
write a
I, you
book.
know, no, I need to sort of like learn how to start and how to think
Yeah.
through writing a novel and these sorts of
Yeah.
things, you know. So it's not just sitting with attention, it's sitting in it constructively,
Yeah.
processing it, going out and asking questions and
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah, yeah. I think this is it. It's the key, isn't it? It's asking questions, but maybe the fear is the answers that they're going to get from those questions that they ask
Mm,
people.
yeah.
You know, and maybe be clear about that you've listened, you've heard, but you've made maybe an alternative decision compared to what you were going to do. You know, things like that to bear in mind as well. Any thoughts on, you know, if someone was to take one thing away from our conversation today, what do you think that that should be, or is there one tip that you would leave people with to start the journey on thinking differently?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I guess one thing that I often suggest, because it's so practical and makes such a difference, is finding like 30 seconds, trying to make a practice of having 30 seconds, not between every call or every meeting or task or something, but like, you know, just try once a day where you literally shut off, or not, don't shut down everything, but just like switch away from the stimulation.
Yeah,
Um, and, you know, I sometimes just like when I'm going from thing to thing to thing, I notice I'm not, you know, we said the first step of thinking well is like noticing what's going on,
yeah,
and then noticing your thinking and starting to bake in some agency and some choice and see what you want to do about it. And we're never going to get there if we're so busy that we don't notice what's going on. And I,
yeah,
you know, I'm this is what I do for a living, and I struggle with that.
yeah,
So I have to, you know, each day make myself go, right, I'm just going to sit, like, you know, when I'm in London on the tube, I can get away with shutting my eyes for 30 seconds, or in a lift, or like sometimes, you know, if I'm working from home, I can just sit comfortably, close my eyes, you know, not have any music on or anything like that. And there's this, like, the phenomenon of it, the physical experience of it is like I almost feel my cognition like catching up to myself, you know, because so much of my lived experience is like in the screen, you know,
yeah,
in the tech, in the stuff, or on the page, or whatever I'm trying to work on. And I feel like I take a break and I go make a coffee, but really I'm listening to a podcast, or I'm doing all these different things. I'm looking at the
yeah.
news. There's
Or
not
you're
a lot of quiet.
processing, you're thinking about something that you
Yeah,
have to do, or yeah, something that you have to action, or yeah,
yeah. And I'm not saying that um, the only way to get better at thinking is to go on a silent retreat and do this massive thing for like a week or something. That would be great. But I think by what I've noticed in my own life is by sitting for like, and it can just be 30 seconds. I mean, 5 minutes is great. That's quite painful actually at the start, but like 30 seconds is great. And just notice some of the stuff. Some ideas might come up to mind then, and you go, oh,
mm,
that's interesting. Oh, yeah, I forgot to do that thing. Or like, just notice what's happening in yourself. Notice what you're feeling, what you're doing.
yeah,
And that might be a prompt to go, oh, do you know what? I'm thirsty. Or I didn't notice that. Or I'm feeling a bit like stressed. That's interesting. Maybe I need to do something. But what I've found is that just by practicing that,
yeah.
um, I'm faster at noticing stuff that's going on inside myself and what's going on
Yeah.
in the world when I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
doing that. Right.
Yes,
So,
before without the need to actually take that time, you're
yeah.
starting to notice more. Yeah,
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 because it
yeah,
is like a muscle. So it's not that you only get insights when you're being mindful or something. It's
yeah,
that you practice that, and then when you're in meetings, you're just that bit faster to go, oh, do you know what, I feel this thing in me, or I've got this question I need to ask. Okay, I'm going to be courageous and ask it. And so I think, as a great place to start, I think anyone can sit still, hopefully. Well, maybe not, walking might do it as well, but I think it's important to try to shut down as much stimulation as possible.
Yeah, really interesting. So we're so busy doing that, we're kind of, the thinking is on autopilot. So if you take that 30 seconds to notice what's going on in your body, how you're feeling, really connecting back in with what's going on for you, then it can make a huge difference and build that muscle over time. Love that. Love that approach. Now, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
Oh, that is delicious. I love it. That's a great question. And I knew you were going to ask this because I've listened through the podcasts and things. And I guess when I was thinking about it, it's really hard to answer. But where I landed was, I think being happier at work is knowing that the effort I put in is not a waste.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's the simplest way I can put it, because after that you could get into, well, what counts as a waste and what's worth it.
Yeah. But it's that you're having a positive impact, let's say, on those around you.
Yeah, right. And if we dig into that, we could say, well, there's like outcomes matter. There's how it's developing my character matters. The intentionality behind it matters. And the relationship matters. And those are actually like 4 schools of thought of ethics.
Okay.
Is deontology, which is all about the intention, which you make something good. Utilitarianism is all about the outcomes. Ethics of care, and people like Karen Jones, working in Australia at the moment, are doing, that's an ethics of care and relationships. And Aristotle is all about how you're developing your character. And so that's also kind of what's running in the background, but I think that's kind of a mouthful. And so that's why I sort of go, I think it's about knowing that you're not wasting your time or your life.
Yeah. That everything hasn't been a complete and utter waste of time.
Right.
If people want to learn more about what you do, if they want to reach out to connect with you, Brennan, what is the best way they can do that?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn at Dr. Brennan Jacoby. That's Brennan, Jacoby, the Y at the end. Also, website is www.philosophyatwork.co.uk. And we're on Instagram as well at Philosophy at Work. And yeah, just reach out that way. Drop us a note. It's always great to chat with people that are wrestling with, I think, meaningful work and trying to understand as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always love to encourage people to get involved in the conversation, both on LinkedIn and on Instagram, just by commenting or just sharing their own, sharing their own experience of what came up for them when they were listening to this specific podcast episode. So, hopefully people will have some insights, some light bulb moments from what we discussed today. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Aoife. Yeah, I really love what you're doing. And it's great to get to dip in and be a part of it.
Thanks so much.